Hey there and welcome back to another Disney video. And today I want to dive into a decade of Disney films that I feel like's been heavily overlooked for a very long time. And of course, by the title, you'll know that I'm talking about the 2000s. Now, in general, the 2000s were a very good era for animation. We saw the rise of DreamWorks as a very successful studio, with some of their biggest hit franchises like Shrek, Kung Fu Panda, and Madagascar getting their start here. And then on top of that, we also saw the golden run from Pixar. Films like Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, WALL-E, Up. Veritable classics of animation. Toy Story might have birthed Pixar, but this string of films forged them into perhaps the most prestigious animation company in history. And although their recent films aren't being as warmly received as they used to be, I still think this perception's remaining. And so, this brings us to the 2000s era of Disney animated studios. The Dark Ages, the fall from grace. That's what this run of films is seemingly considered. And it's a shame because ultimately, I don't think these films are really all that bad, or at least most of them. Obviously, yes, they might not be on the same tier of quality or success as the films from the 90s, or a lot of their recent films from the 2010s, but at the same time, I don't think they're wholly deserving of the hate that they accumulated when they were first released. And so today, I'm going to try to convince you to give this era another chance. To convince you that some of these films are much better on a second go around, and that the 2000s wasn't as much of a fail for Disney as you might have thought. And so, with all that being said, let's get started, going through the classics one by one to explain why they might deserve a bit more love or why they might suck. And so Disney kicked off the new millennium with a film that's almost certainly considered a classic by today's perspective, The Emperor's New Groove. It follows Cusco, Emperor of the Incas, who's turned into a llama in a failed assassination attempt by his advisor Yzma, who then tries to usurp his throne. And thus he's forced to rely on the peasants he exploited in order to survive and regain what he lost, eventually changing his ways along the way. And yeah, at the time, didn't do so well. It was a bit of a financial flop, and that's ridiculous to think now, as it went on to become a cult classic and made a huge dent in the home video market. But at the time, it seemed like people weren't ready to let go of grand, epic musicals of the Disney Renaissance, and thus they didn't embrace what The Emperor's New Groove was bringing to the table. Whilst those critics that did go and see it, liked it, and sits on 86% on Rotten Tomatoes currently, it wasn't what the audience was looking for at that point in time. That massive shift wouldn't really come until the release of Shrek, which pretty much changed the game in terms of what people were looking for in an animated experience. So already, in hindsight, we're starting the decade off middling, but still strong. The Emperor's New Groove. In hindsight, a great film that did well, just maybe not at the box office. But then we come to Atlantis, The Lost Empire, and I've decided that Disney and sci-fi just don't mix because this film failed and failed hard. Later on, we'll see that Treasure Planet also failed. And recently, we saw the release and flop of Strange World. I mean, there are exceptions to this, but for the most part, Disney sci-fi is either bad or forgettable. And I just think, yeah, it's not what people want from Disney. I don't know why, but historically these films mostly fail. I also don't think it's always fair. This film is actually legitimately bad though. A 49% critical score and a 54% audience score. I mean, I enjoyed it well enough as a kid, but I never clamoured to rewatch it like I did other Disney films. And watching it back years later, whew, that was a bit rough honestly. The characters were paper thin, the plot was dull, the jokes fell flat, and it broke my nostalgic little heart, but it is what it is. It just ain't good. But then we come to Lilo and Stitch. Lilo and Stitch. I don't know how any era that has a film of this quality can possibly be considered bad, but here we are. This is Disney's best effort in terms of trying to make sci-fi work. One that was successful financially and critically. It sits on an 87% critical score on Rotten Tomatoes, and did well at the box office despite having to compete with the release of Spider-Man and Star Wars Attack of the Clones. Two big competitors. And then on top of that, it went on to become a merch extravaganza, thanks to Stitch, and was yet another Disney film that became a smash on home media release. And it really isn't hard to see why. The film is filled to the brim with heart and charm, has hilarious and iconic characters, a great contrast between the suburban environment and alien technology, a killer soundtrack, and a gripping storyline. What's not to love? And so, that's another win for Disney in the 2000s in my eyes, which brings us to Treasure Planet. It has a 69% critical score, a 72% audience score, so, it's not an awful film. It is fun, it has a decent storyline, cool design choices, an enjoyable if forgettable soundtrack, and good performances. And yet, it was a complete and utter financial failure. A box office bomb of the highest order. One that is considered one of the biggest financial disasters of all time, especially for Disney. And whilst, yeah, financial failures are bad and all, the film itself wasn't bad. It just merely failed to generate any interest. And so, I don't think this should be included in the list of terrible films of the Dark Age, but at the same time, you can't call it a success either. Feels par for the course. And then after that film, it's where the era does start to dip in actual quality quite hard. We have the release of Brother Bear, and critics seem to hate this film. It got 37% on Rotten Tomatoes, and I will say, the critics are wrong. This movie, it's not anything special, but it's still a fun, lighthearted romp about love, loss, and finding a family. It's honestly a joke to me that it somehow scored less than Home on the Range. Like, come on. The audience score? Far more acceptable. It has a 65% score. You know, not perfect, but it's where it deserves to be. In terms of actual animation quality, it doesn't really look all that exciting or grand, especially when you compare it to something like Treasure Planet, which was a massive visual undertaking, probably why it lost so much money. And its story, whilst fun, is a little bit basic. I don't know, for me the narrative feels like it comes straight from the 80s Disney. You know, kind of like Balto, a film I talked about recently. You know, they're not bad, but just feel a bit outdated. It's not what people were hungering for anymore. They wanted a bit more complexity. And you know, even in hindsight now, I feel like it still has that perception. It's a little too basic, and so whilst the film did do well at the box office, it was nothing special at the same time. So it breaks my heart because I love this film, but I can accept that this film probably deserves to belong in the 2000 flop pile. But at the same time, I do have to argue against that because audiences liked it more than they hated it. I mean, screw the critics. And it did well at the box office. What more do you need? And also, side note, yet another glorious Disney soundtrack from Phil Collins. Ah, I love his soundtracks. Hell yeah. Which takes us to Home on the Range. And yeah, this film is actually bad. It's trash. There's no denying that. If you only take the wrong critics into account, it was a step up from Brother Bear, somehow. It has a 52% on Rotten Tomatoes. But the reality is far from that. It has a 29% audience score. It's a film laden with cringe and very few laughs, and was a box office bomb. Yep, chuck this one on the fail pile. And speaking of which, next we arrive at Chicken Little, which, much like Home on the Range, is a mostly unfunny waste of time. It did poorly with both critics and audiences at 36 and 46% scores respectively, and is never looked back on fondly as far as I can see. People prefer to just not think about it at all. But despite that, it wasn't a 100% fail either, because it was actually their biggest financial success in years, grossing $314 million off a budget of $150 million. So it's not breaking any records, but much better than what they'd managed to achieve outside of Lilo and Stitch before. They never really managed to make a huge dent like they could during the 90s, until this film came out. And you know, it's probably due to the fact that they used 3D computer animation, which was novel for this studio at the time. But yeah, the film itself is arse, and it's largely been forgotten to time, where it deserves to be. And so you can't really count this as a 100% success either. Which in turn brings us to Meet the Robinsons, which is yet another Disney venture into sci-fi that did not pan out. Once again, it was a box office bomb. And despite it being a genuinely decent film that did well enough with both critics and audiences, it was never able to crack the market, and once again, despite its relative popularity, it's largely been forgotten to time. Not surprising. Every aspect of this film just oozes forgettableness. There's nothing memorable here except perhaps the villain. I mean, seriously, Goob is such a well-written villain. It's a shame he doesn't get more love. Which brings us to Bolt, which is where Disney really starts to come to life, and it's credited as being the proper start of the Disney revival era that led to their most financially and critically lucrative era of all time in the late 2000s through the 2010s. It's a genuinely great film that has a box office performance reminiscent of Chicken Little, with much better reviews. It has a 90% critical score and a 74% audience score. And it's not hard to see why. The film has so much heart, compelling characters, a heartfelt story. What's not to love? And yeah, like I said, it ushered in a new era for Disney, which was followed up with Princess and the Frog, which once again was another box office success for the studio. I mean, still not hitting those highs that get in the 2010s, but acceptable nonetheless. And was also a critical success, with an 85% critical score and a 74% audience score. It gathered Oscar nominations and pretty much brought back princess films, but with the new twist of the princess being the hero in her own right. And this would be followed up with films like Tangled and Frozen, Moana, and so yet another major success for the studio that would set the stage for their explosion in the following decade. And that brings us to the end of the filmography. And so you can see that whilst the 2000s is considered a lost decade for the studio, filled with failure after failure, considered an era where Disney was spinning its wheels and unable to decide on what creative direction they wished to take with the company, I'd argue it's really not as bad as it seems. They would get bits and pieces right. The Emperor's New Groove was a smash hit, but only after it came out on video, but now it's remembered as a classic. Lilo and Stitch, Bolt, Princess and the Frog. They were straight up triumphs. Brother Bear did well at the box office and audiences liked it well enough, even if critics hated it, which to me makes it successful still. So already that's 5 out of 10 that are true success stories of the 2000s. Chicken Little, whilst being shit and hated by audiences and critics alike, still pulled in good money, and it saved the studio from a financial slump. So at minimum, you can say that one sits on the fence, 50-50. Whilst Meet the Robinsons is the opposite. It was a disgrace at the box office, but it was good. Treasure Planet similarly, a terrible financial flop, even worse than Meet the Robinsons, but it was still a good film. Atlantis, that's just no good and didn't make any money, and neither did Home on the Range. And so, now sitting here, I can't help but feel that the 2000s have really been unfairly shit on by so many, me included to be fair, for years. Yeah, they weren't perfect, but I think they were trying to find their feet in a new era. An era where Pixar and DreamWorks had changed the game on them, after they'd already done the same thing during the 90s. And so yeah, they had to scramble to catch up, and they didn't always succeed. But I think it's simply made worse in terms of optics by 3 major factors. 1, they were coming out of the Disney Renaissance, and so these films looked worse by comparison. 2, they led into the Disney Revival era, which makes these films look worse by comparison. And 3, Pixar and DreamWorks were well and truly popping off in this era, which made them look worse in comparison. And so really, I think this is more an instance of looking worse than it really was, and people looking back and hating these films, despite them not being truly bad, and people looking back and taking a handful of the bad films and saying that that represents the majority. But it's not really true. And so hopefully today I've helped to somewhat set the record straight regarding this era of Disney's filmography. It's not that bad. I mean, it's by no means perfect, I'm not delusional, but it's not terrible either. And so, with all that being said, that's the end of the video. And I would like to say that these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of the 2000s Disney era? Do you agree with me that hatred's overdone, or maybe you think I'm the one who's delusional? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.